Pero a veces pienso que si tuviera la oportunidad de volverme a encontrar con Hitler, pues en este mundo o en cualquier otro, seguro que le preguntaría qué habría hecho si en su propio árbol genealógico hubiese descubierto sangre judía, si habría gaseado él mismo.
In the annals of the Third Reich, few names evoke such proximity to Hitler's inner circle as that of Traudl Junge. She arrived as a mere young typist from Munich and soon became his personal secretary. From the luminous corridors of the Reich Chancellery to the stifling Führerbunker in Berlin, she witnessed firsthand the dictator's daily routine and the collapse of his empire. She held no military rank or political influence, but her position placed her at the heart of Nazi power. She was the hand that typed Hitler's speeches as the front crumbled, and the unwitting listener to secrets no one else was meant to know. Confidence is destined to remain buried behind the walls of the Führerbunker. After Hitler's fall, she faced the chaos of defeat, Soviet raids, interrogations, and violence that seemed endless. Over the years, the experiences of the Reich and the post-war period profoundly marked her, leaving a trauma that accompanied her until the end of her days. This documentary revives her testimony, that of the last secretary who saw Hitler alive. From Munich to Berlin, the initiatory journey to the Reich Chancellery. Traudl Junge came into the world in Munich on the 16th of March, 1920, in a city marked by political instability and social misery. Barely a month earlier, in a crowded beer hall, Hitler and Anton Drexler had presented the program of the newly founded National Socialist Party, aimed at those suffering from hunger, unemployment, and humiliation after the war. The contrast between the life of an ordinary family and the awakening of a movement promising redemption was already inscribed in her birth. Her father, Max Humps, was a master brewer, but he soon lost his job and joined the Freikorps Oberland, a paramilitary group fighting in the name of aggressive nationalism. He participated in the failed coup of 1923 and received the Nazi Party's decoration known as the Blood Order. Years later, his daughter would reflect that his militancy had been driven more by camaraderie and chance than by genuine ideology. However, at home his presence was unstable. He abandoned his wife Hildegard and their daughters, leaving behind an economic and emotional void that shaped Traudl's childhood. Her mother sought support from her own parents. In their household, the stern discipline of her grandfather Maximilian coexisted with the tenderness of her grandmother Agathe, whose death in 1928 was a devastating blow to the young girl. From then on, her grandfather's authority grew even harsher, while Hildegard bore the weight of family responsibilities and the mental illness of her brother Hans, who years later would fall victim to the Nazi regime's sterilization laws. Despite the hardships, such as reduced school fees and outings she could not afford, the bond between mother and daughters grew stronger. Hildegard instilled principles of integrity and simplicity, and these values would accompany Traudl even in the darkest settings of her future life. Vivacious and sociable, she found refuge in nature, art, and physical movement. In 1933, while the new German Chancellor dazzled many with promises of greatness, Traudl discovered a more intimate fascination: dance. Watching her younger sister's classes, she felt that her true destiny lay there. Her dream became so consuming that she set aside other plans. Over the following years, she clung to that vocation with the hope of carving out a path on the stage. Upon finishing school in 1936, she thought she could support herself with an office job while perfecting her artistic technique. However, the precariousness of work and lack of time turned that idea into a difficult illusion to sustain. Even so, she accepted an administrative position she disliked, but which offered a stable income and the chance to continue training. Deep down, she remained convinced it was merely a stepping stone before achieving her true purpose. The war transformed that horizon. When she finally passed her dance exams in 1941 and submitted her resignation from her company, she discovered that the Reich's bureaucracy had imposed controls on employment. It was no longer possible to freely choose one's professional path. Typing and secretarial work were deemed essential, while the world of entertainment had become dispensable. At just 21 years old, the young woman realized that the time invested in perfecting her body for the stage was slipping away in the face of a conflict that showed no signs of ending soon. That frustration crystallized into resentment toward her boss, whom she blamed for ruining her life by not accepting her resignation, though deep down it was the state that set the priorities. Her sister Inga, who worked as a dancer in Berlin, opened an unexpected bridge to another possibility. A colleague of hers had connections with Albert Bormann, brother of Martin and an influential figure in the Chancellery. Through that contact, Traudl received an invitation to move to the capital and work as a secretary. The mere prospect of leaving Munich and experiencing life in the metropolis was thrilling, especially since it was her first time on an overnight train. Upon arriving at the imposing seat of the Reich Chancellery, she felt a mix of fascination and fear, like someone stepping into a world they do not fully control but can no longer turn away from. In that labyrinthine building, she began by performing minor tasks, sorting correspondence destined for the Führer. She could not have imagined then that a rumor would soon circulate, one capable of changing her fate. They were seeking young typists for Hitler's innermost circle. Speed and accuracy tests were organized, and against her own expectations, she ranked among the best. Thus, she received a train ticket that would take her, along with 9 other young women, to the hidden quarters in the forests of East Prussia, where the final selection and an encounter with the man who would shape the course of her life awaited. Their stay on the train, converted into temporary lodging, lasted longer than expected, until one night the order came to present themselves before the Führer. The young secretaries, overcome with nerves, were led through checkpoints to a bunker hidden in the forest. In the waiting room, Heinz Linger explained how to greet him. Shortly afterward, Albert Bormann escorted them to the main office. Behind the imposing doors appeared Hitler, smiling and unhurried, shaking each of their hands. When it was Traudl's turn, her youth and Munich origins seemed to capture his attention. The encounter was brief, almost ceremonial, but it left the young women shaken. Back on the train, amid impromptu toasts, they speculated about who had made the best impression. They soon learned that one final test remained, to demonstrate speed and accuracy in typing a dictation. Days passed with minor tasks and games until Traudl was summoned alone to Hitler's office. He received her cordially and dictated a routine document. The young woman transcribed it without major errors and handed over the pages as instructed. Hitler was satisfied, and without the need for further comparisons, it was decided that this young woman from Munich would join his closest circle. Learning hierarchies, the young secretary among assistants and comrades. Life at the headquarters in East Prussia soon became a peculiar routine for Traudl Junge. The snowy landscape offered her calm, but the essence lay not in the surroundings, but in the way that isolated space functioned as a world unto itself, governed by its own rules, and a small circle of people. During the first weeks, she received few direct assignments. Her days consisted of waiting for news from the personal assistants, who each morning indicated whether she was needed or could have free time. Moments when she managed to approach the Führer were rare, usually when he was with his dog Blondie, whom he trained with dedication and who had become his main companion. Those brief greetings reinforced in Traudl the sense of being in a closed environment where every interaction depended on highly defined rituals. While waiting, she began to familiarize herself with those who upheld the domestic and ceremonial machinery of the Nazi leader. Heinz Linger and Hans Junge, from the personal guard, alternated duties as valets. Their role went far beyond mere assistance. They were responsible for organizing meals, schedules, and even the atmosphere in which Hitler received news. Linger, in particular, was considered a mediator, as even high-ranking regime officials consulted him about the right moment to raise delicate matters. Another ever-present figure was Julius Schaub, the chief aide and a companion of Hitler's since the early days of the party. His loyalty and knowledge of the dictator's personal secrets made him untouchable, despite his eccentric character and tendency to exaggerate his importance. For the secretaries, Schaub was a kind of supervisor, as much of their correspondence had to be drafted and reviewed by them. Daily life also included the organization of the compound's kitchen, under the direction of a cook nicknamed Crumbs, tasked with feeding hundreds of people daily. His obligation to prepare vegetarian menus for Hitler revealed both the dictator's modesty in matters of food and the constant tension between the leader's preferences and the staff tasked with serving him. In this environment of informal hierarchies and interwoven dependencies, Traudl's role gradually gained weight until, in January of 1943, she was summoned to transcribe a commemorative speech for the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, confirming her definitive integration into the inner circle. With that integration came a new sensitivity to the internal rhythms of the wolf's lair. What seemed immutable could change abruptly. One morning, Traudl noticed unusual activity, vehicles coming and going relentlessly, aides hurrying through the bunker, and an atmosphere of anticipation that contrasted with the usual routine. Shortly afterward, she was called to Julius Schaub's office, where he handed her a document to type with instructions to maintain absolute discretion. The text contained Hitler's travel plan to the Eastern Front. It was a visit to positions in Vinnytsia, Ukraine, and only a select few were permitted to accompany him: his doctor, some military aides, 2 orderlies, and a personal assistant. Traudl's name was not among those chosen. That afternoon, the bunker suddenly emptied. The young woman would describe that absence as if the force that drove the entire place had been abruptly disconnected. She then understood the extent to which the lives of dozens of people depended on the physical presence of a single man. For 3 days, an unsettling silence reigned. No one in the garrison seemed to know when the entourage would return or what news was arriving from the front. It was later learned that an explosive device had been placed on the plane meant to bring Hitler back, and that, due to unforeseen circumstances, it failed to detonate. The leader was never informed of the danger he had faced, but the episode revealed how close he had come to disappearing, and with him, the entire system he held under his control. The return brought with it the resumption of routine, though not for long. Soon after, Traudl received another itinerary to transcribe, this time with a novelty. Her own name, along with those of the other secretaries, was included among the members of the expedition. The destination was not the front this time, but Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, where Hitler planned to combine periods of rest with official receptions at the Berghof. At the end of March 1943, Traudl thus joined the massive transfer of the machinery of power that accompanied every movement of the dictator. The journey to Berchtesgaden marked Traudl's definitive integration into the routine of the Alpine residence. The Berghof, unlike the Prussian austerity of the wolf's lair, offered a brighter setting, though no less rigid. There, mornings passed in complete silence until noon, when officers and advisors attended conferences, and the secretaries remained on standby, aware that any mistake could disrupt a carefully designed mechanism. In that context, meals took on a ceremonial significance. Hitler always led the procession, followed by Eva Braun and Martin Bormann, while the guests were seated according to their rank. The dining room was adorned with flowers and impeccable tableware, but beneath that appearance of intimacy lay a strict protocol. For the young secretaries, this ritual reinforced the sensation of living within a political theatre where even the most trivial gestures were regulated. Eva Braun emerged in these scenes as a striking presence. Her interests in fashion and photography set her apart from the feminine ideal exalted by propaganda, and she was the only one permitted to point a camera at the Führer. However, that freedom had strict limits. Any change in her appearance triggered Hitler's immediate disapproval. When she decided to darken her hair slightly, he reacted with severity, stating that she looked like a different woman. A similar incident occurred when she experimented with a different hairstyle. The criticism was so strong that Eva promptly returned to her previous style. These episodes, witnessed by those living at the Berghof, revealed the extent to which the leader's private life was subject to an obsessive rigidity. For Traudl, the contrast was evident. In the same space, discussions about dresses or pets could coexist with meetings that decided military operations. This overlap of the mundane and the momentous turned the Berghof into a stage where the domestic was never truly private and politics permeated every aspect of daily life. According to Traudl, this blending of spheres was also reflected in Hitler's persona, who, at the Berghof, far from rallies and crowds, rarely spoke of politics directly. He maintained that Germany would prevail because it fought for an ideal against the materialism of its enemies, and claimed that only Russia constituted a true rival, as it too fought from its own worldview. His secretaries and companions listened without daring to question him, captivated by the authority he exuded even in seemingly relaxed conversations. In private, he said he felt deprived of simple pleasures due to the weight of his role. He would have liked to walk incognito through a city, buy gifts, or sit in a cafe, but he rejected any disguise. He claimed his voice and fame would betray him immediately, and the fervor of the crowd would ruin any attempt at anonymity. His public appearances were increasingly rare. Even in Berlin or during train journeys, he lived behind curtains and artificial light, replicating the dimness of the bunkers where he felt secure. In that enclosed environment, certain figures gained special influence. One was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and the regime's favorite architect. Hitler valued him for his organizational skills and above all for considering him a kindred spirit. Unlike other hierarchs who merely nodded in agreement, Speer dared to disagree, and Hitler listened to his arguments with unusual attention. This personal bond made him one of the few capable of genuinely influencing his decisions. Another frequent presence at the Berghof was Heinrich Hoffmann, a photographer from the party's early days. His long-standing friendship with Hitler secured him a place in the inner circle, despite criticism of his excessive drinking and private life. Though he was appointed an honorary professor and remained the official portraitist, his behavior scandalized many. To Traudl, it was striking that certain comrades from the movement's youth were protected, while others were cast aside without hesitation. A contradiction that highlighted how personal loyalty could outweigh the discipline or morality proclaimed. This climate of contradictions was occasionally interrupted by foreign visits. The first in 1943 was that of Benito Mussolini, and in the days leading up to it, Hitler displayed a particularly optimistic mood. He spoke with admiration of the Duce, whom he considered a politician capable of leading a difficult and divided people, and recounted anecdotes from previous trips to Rome in an almost complicit tone. According to Traudl, it was evident that he expected more than camaraderie from the meeting. He sought material support at a time when the war demanded ever greater resources. On the day of the reception, the weather was described as perfect propaganda. Clear skies, bright sun and snow on the mountains surrounding Klesheim Castle. There, official ceremonies took place, while an unusual calm reigned at the Berghof. Traudl took advantage of that absence to catch up on correspondence, aware that such a respite was rare. The visit, however, confirmed that the Alpine residence served not only as a refuge, but also as a carefully staged diplomatic setting. Other delegations arrived in the following weeks. Antonescu from Romania, Horthy from Hungary, Tiso from Slovakia, and Boris from Bulgaria. The young secretary recalled that during those days, she barely saw Hitler until late in the afternoon. On one occasion, she accidentally found herself in the middle of the reception for the Bulgarian king, rushing in with a pair of ping-pong paddles in one hand and an apple in the other. The scene, awkward for her, was downplayed by Hitler with a kind remark. "Kings are human too." In Traudl's eyes, this blend of ceremonial rigidity and unexpectedly mundane gestures perfectly defined the atmosphere of the Berghof. Meanwhile, on the 1st of May, Labor Day, Traudl was summoned to type a new speech. Hitler insisted he preferred to improvise, but admitted that in wartime he had to measure every word. According to the young secretary, that was one of the long, sleepless nights, typing without pause until dawn, so that by noon his voice would resound across all the radios of the Reich. The fall of Mussolini, Hitler's fury at Italy's betrayal. After those weeks marked by official receptions and long nights of speeches, the routine at the Berghof took an unexpected turn. In early July of 1943, Traudl experienced one of those departures shrouded in absolute secrecy. The previous night, she had dined with Hitler without any mention of it, and the next morning, the activity in the compound revealed that something significant was about to happen. Stacked suitcases, orderlies rushing about, and Schaub, more solemn than usual, suggested a special mission was underway. Only by chance did she learn she needed to prepare, though no one would clarify the destination or duration of the absence. It was Linge, who, in a hurry, told her only to pack what was necessary for a few days away. The mystery was resolved during the journey to the airfield when one of the stenographers asked if she had been to Italy before. That comment revealed the true destination. Hitler was going to meet Mussolini. The group landed in northern Italy and was transferred to the duties train, from which they departed in a motorcade to a nearby villa designated for the talks. Traudl remained on the train, surprised by the dirtiness of the carriages and the outdated air of the service, while the Italian summer heat felt almost unbearable to her. The meeting, however, yielded no lasting results. Barely weeks later, Mussolini was overthrown and taken prisoner, and the Italian fascist regime was crumbling. Hitler erupted in anger upon hearing the news, convinced that the alliance with Italy had caused more problems than benefits. According to Traudl, that night he was visibly irritated, unable to hide his bad mood even in the presence of his secretaries. The following months were marked by an increasingly somber atmosphere. Christmas of 1943 passed unnoticed, without festive symbols or celebrations. For Traudl, it was also a difficult time personally, as her husband returned on leave transformed into someone unrecognizable, affected by the distance from the front and the sense that Hitler no longer grasped the magnitude of the crisis. Shortly afterward, he was reassigned far from the east due to new security measures, a separation that underscored for her the fragility of personal bonds in the midst of a regime that consumed all private life. After those bleak months and the separation from her husband, the spring of 1944 brought Traudl back to the Berghof, though the center of gravity of the regime remained in East Prussia. There, Hitler had ordered the reinforcement of his headquarters with colossal concrete bunkers designed to withstand bombings. In Traudl's eyes, the idea of living underground, deprived of sunlight, felt suffocating. But at that moment, the dictator placed more trust in fortifications than in any diplomatic efforts, and talk increasingly centered on security rather than victories. At the Berghof, meanwhile, meetings were organized with military commanders, industrialists and political officials. Hitler delivered lengthy improvised speeches without the need for notes, convinced that before internal audiences he could be more direct. Among the attendees was Marshal Eduard Dietl, who arrived from the Norwegian front and was decorated there with the diamonds of the Knight's Cross. The admiration Hitler expressed for him contrasted with the news of his death the following day in a plane crash. The leader, shocked and pained, repeatedly reproached his generals for taking unnecessary risks, as their loss was irreplaceable. Weeks later, another accident near Salzburg claimed the life of General Hans Valentin Huber, reminding him once again of the vulnerability of even the military elite. During that period, a new figure emerged in the inner circle, Hermann Fegelein. A decorated cavalry officer and Eva Braun's brother-in-law after his marriage to Gretel, he moved with ease among high-ranking officials and quickly gained Bormann's trust. His open demeanor and irony allowed him to rise rapidly, becoming a constant presence at the Berghof. According to Traudl, his arrival altered the dynamic of the environment, introducing a lighter tone amid an atmosphere laden with tensions. But personal matters were overshadowed by the events on the Western Front. The Allied landing in Normandy forced the interruption of any stay in the Alps. Traudl's own husband, who had enjoyed a brief leave, was immediately sent back to the combat line. At the beginning of July, Hitler ordered the return to the headquarters in East Prussia. What they found upon arrival were no longer the small bunkers they had known, but concrete structures camouflaged under vegetation, with improvised rooms serving as offices and a large cabin adapted for conferences over gigantic maps. There, with the secretaries reunited, the work intensified, and social life was completely subordinated to the war machine. The summer of 1944 in the Wolf's Lair seemed to repeat the same routine as always, until a deafening explosion shattered the calm. Traudl was typing when she heard a blast she initially mistook for weapons testing in the forest. Only when she heard shouts calling for a doctor did she realize it was something different. Confusion gripped the secretaries, who emerged from their rooms with pale faces, unsure whether the Führer was still alive. The idea of an assassination attempt barely dared to be voiced, but fear mingled with an inevitable question. What would happen if Hitler died, and who would take his place? Amid the chaos, bloodied officers appeared, like Jodl and Weisenegger, their eardrums shattered by the explosion. Shortly afterward, Otto Günsche confirmed that Hitler was unharmed and back in his bunker. When Traudl saw him, she could hardly believe it. Dishevelled, with torn trousers and a bruised arm, he was joking that fate had preserved him to fulfill his mission. The blast had destroyed the conference room, leaving dead and seriously injured among those present, but the dictator showed barely a scratch. As the hours passed, rumours turned into certainties. The perpetrator of the attack was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who had smuggled a bomb in his briefcase and left it just a few meters from the table where Hitler stood. The shockwave killed a stenographer and injured several generals, but it failed to achieve its main objective. While Stauffenberg fled, convinced he had succeeded, Hitler had already resumed his duties, standing taller and more confident than ever. The news of the plot shook Berlin. Some commanders wavered between joining the coup or reaffirming their loyalty. The final decision was made by Colonel Remer, who, obeying Goebbels, secured control of the capital and sealed the failure of the military resistance. The next day, he was decorated by Hitler himself. According to Traudl's recollection, that afternoon the leader displayed unusual energy, turning the failed assassination attempt into proof of his invulnerability. For him, the 20th of July was not a warning, but a confirmation that fate protected him. This interpretation, reinforced by many around him, deepened his conviction that the war could still be won, and that any attempt to remove him from power was not only treason, but an attack on the future of Germany and Europe. From the failed assassination to the Berlin bunker, the final descent into the abyss. The failed assassination had bolstered Hitler's faith in his destiny, but by 1945, that certainty began to crack under the weight of reality. The transfer to Berlin marked the beginning of a definitive confinement. The special train carried Hitler and his entourage back to the capital, where the new bunker beneath the Chancellery awaited, transformed into a permanent residence. What had been conceived as a temporary shelter against bombings became the final command center, a concrete fortress hidden beneath 11 meters of thickness. For Traudl Junge, each descent down the stairs into those narrow rooms was a metaphor for the collapse that loomed ahead. In that confined space, life took on a strange rhythm. During the day, light conversations around the table persisted, as if the war were irrelevant, but the roar of artillery grew ever closer. At night, air raids forced everyone to remain underground, sharing dinners in the small room where Hitler worked and slept. To Traudl, the contrast was unsettling. Above ground, a city on the brink of collapse. Below, a closed circle stubbornly pretending at normalcy. Hitler, increasingly rigid and consumed by an obsession to resist, frequently invoked the memory of Frederick the Great as an example of perseverance to the end. His words revealed both hatred for the enemy and an unshakable faith in his historical role. For those around him, this blend of conviction and fatalism was hard to openly question, though doubts grew silently. On the 20th of April, as Soviet cannons already echoed nearby, Hitler's birthday was celebrated. Old collaborators came to express their loyalty, though many urged him to leave the city before being trapped. Hitler rejected all proposals. He was determined to stay in Berlin, convinced that his fate must be decided there. The most disconcerting scene unfolded outside in the devastated garden when he awarded decorations to boys from the Hitler Youth who had faced Russian tanks. That image encapsulated the paradox of the end, the stubborn resolve to resist, relying on children turned into soldiers. That night, as Hitler retired early, Eva Braun tried to stifle fear with a final burst of vitality. She organized an impromptu party in her old salon, salvaging music and champagne amidst a ruined Berlin. For Traudl, that desperate dance, interrupted from time to time by distant explosions, was nothing more than a reflection of an existence suspended between denial and the approaching collapse. On the 22nd of April 1945, the bunker became a cauldron of nerves. Outside, Soviet cannons roared so loudly that it seemed impossible to distinguish whether the shots came from friendly or enemy troops. Inside, the secretaries took refuge in trivial conversations while awaiting news from the conference room. From there came muffled shouts, confused orders, and Hitler's voice rising intermittently. When the door finally opened, Traudl saw a different man, motionless, with a vacant stare and a face reminiscent of a funeral mask. It was then that he uttered the unthinkable, "All is lost." That moment, which seemed to seal Germany's fate and his own, was marked by an unusual gesture. Before the officers waiting, Hitler kissed Eva Braun on the lips, as if for the first time accepting to share with her the intimacy of a farewell. In Traudl's eyes, that scene blended desperation and humanity, a strange flicker amidst the collapse. Shortly afterward, the dictator ordered the evacuation of part of his female staff, but she, like others, chose to stay. The following hours were laden with contradictions. After announcing the end, Hitler convened another military meeting and demanded a final effort with whatever remained available in the capital. The order seemed unreal, as if the ruins surrounding the Chancellery could still transform into a front capable of reversing the inevitable. Amid deliberations, the Führer sought comfort in his dogs, stroking a puppy, as if that minimal routine restored a fragment of control. In that atmosphere of anguished waiting, the women received basic pistol training. Months earlier, Hitler had refused to let them try, joking that he didn't want to fall by the hand of a secretary. Now, however, he authorized the exercises, proof of the despair taking hold in every corner of the bunker. There were also moments when the tension eased and the outside reality filtered in unexpectedly. Briefly stepping out to the garden of the Foreign Ministry, Traudl and her companions found a statue among spring flowers. In contrast to the confinement, that scene momentarily restored the sense that life continued beyond the walls. Eva Braun even joked about taking the statue to her garden if everything ended well, eliciting a weary smile from Hitler. It was a trivial conversation, but revealing the desire to cling to the ordinary as the end approached with a clamour underground. Talk of the statue and small everyday gestures vanished abruptly with the roar of a new bombardment. The echo of explosions shook the shelter's ceiling, and as every afternoon the bunker was sealed behind its heavy iron door. Hitler had the radio turned on, not to listen to music, but to follow reports announcing the approach of enemy planes. Soon after, Hitler emerged before the officers with a weary gait. He announced that the war was lost, and that he would remain in the capital to take his own life when the time came. He added that those who wished to leave were free to do so. Those present saluted him in silence and withdrew one by one, many never to return. In Traudl's eyes, that was the true end of the fiction of power. The circle around the Führer was shrinking to near emptiness. In his office, Hitler tasked Julius Schaub with destroying documents and personal mementos. With a dejected air, Schaub carried boxes and folders to the park, where they burned in makeshift bonfires. As Junge recalled, seeing him with teary eyes, saying goodbye before heading to Munich and Berchtesgaden to repeat the task, was a silent blow. Even the most loyal seemed to understand that everything was crumbling. Meanwhile, the shelter's corridors filled with makeshift beds. Secretaries, telephone operators, orderlies and cooks shared cramped, damp rooms, while the kitchen had been moved underground, and the main hallway served as a communal dining area. Traudl would later write that this cramped, privacyless life confirmed that nothing remained of the routine they had once known. Time dragged on with unbearable slowness. She herself admitted feeling empty and exhausted, unable to sleep despite her body's pleas. It was then that Goebbels approached her after a phone call and confided that his wife and their 6 children would join the bunker at Hitler's wish. The news chilled her. Soon after, she saw the children enter joyfully, unsuspecting. Traudl accompanied them to the room where the Führer's birthday gifts were stored, and the little ones chose toys as if visiting a relative's home, unaware that they were playing in the last refuge of a crumbling regime. According to Traudl, what weighed most heavily was not the external danger, but Hitler's transformation. One day, he defended the final victory with conviction, and the next he admitted all was lost, accusing the generals of betraying him and declaring National Socialism dead. For her, hearing those words was like watching the last mask of steadfastness which had held for years shatter. Eva Braun tried to fill that void with desperate loyalty. She asked why Göring, Himmler or Speer did not remain in Berlin. Hitler replied that their absences were understandable, that they could serve him better from outside. But reality soon contradicted that explanation. News spread that Göring had sent a telegram claiming succession to leadership if he received no immediate response from the Führer. In Traudl's eyes, Hitler's reaction was one of uncontainable fury. Bormann, who had intercepted the message, hastened to show it to him with his own interpretation. The Führer, seeing it as a personal betrayal, dismissed the marshal and ordered his arrest. In the bunker's atmosphere, this was discussed with a tone of bitter disbelief. Even the closest allies were already seeking to secure their positions in a future without Hitler. Meanwhile, the climate within the underground fortress oscillated between apathy and delirium. Goebbels proposed a final propaganda effort to show that the Führer was holding out in the capital, as if his mere presence could inspire hope in an exhausted population. In contrast, Hitler seemed to have abandoned any military strategy. He locked himself in his office, appeared absent, and spoke of his death as an inevitable fact. For Traudl, each of those statements added an unbearable weight to the already oppressive atmosphere. Amid this political and personal collapse, the innocence of the Goebbels children offered a disturbing contrast. They played in the corridors, read stories, and shared chocolate with Uncle Hitler, unaware that the poison their mother carried hidden in her purse would soon seal their fate. For Traudl, that scene encapsulated the regime's final contradiction, a facade of childish normalcy under the shadow of an inevitable end. Daily life in the bunker had become a succession of brief respites and shocks. Newspapers had ceased printing, and only the radio repeated that the Führer remained in the city, while we knew, according to Traudl, that he was no longer directing the battle but awaiting his end. Amid this frozen landscape of routine and alarm, episodes arose that further tore apart the group's already fragile cohesion. Hermann Fegelein, the officer who had burst onto the Berchtesgaden scene with energy, disappeared and was finally located in the Chancellery, dressed in civilian clothes, drunk and without insignia. In Traudl's eyes, his image, defeated and humiliated, was that of someone who had lost all sense of military honor. As the details were followed with unease, news arrived that Himmler had attempted to negotiate with the Allies through intermediaries. The revelation hit the bunker like a final betrayal. Hitler, who until then had forgiven personal excesses of old comrades, did not tolerate this duplicity. Fegelein was summarily tried and, stripped of protection and rank, was executed in the Chancellery gardens. According to the account Traudl heard, they killed him right there, under the trees she had admired for their beauty shortly before. The scene left Eva Braun inconsolable, with swollen eyes from crying. That blow opened a chasm of distrust that spread like a stain. Hitler not only suspected Himmler, he began to distrust those who administered his medication. Dr. Stumpfegger, pale and withdrawn, was viewed with suspicion. Even the poison Himmler had provided came under scrutiny. The women took refuge in Eva's bedroom, bringing the children and dogs, trying to create a haven of humanity amid the din. Traudl cared for the little ones, read them stories, and, as she later recounted, strove to keep them unaware of the inevitable. The final hours passed in a haze of waiting and noise. Eva, in a moment of unsettling foresight, let slip a phrase, "I bet you'll cry tonight." No one could know then whether she spoke of tears for what was lost or for what was to come. And so, amid whispers and the rumble of bombs, the day dissolved into a state akin to a feverish dream, as if reality had become a relentless collective nightmare. The 30th of April dawned like any other day in the bunker, though everyone sensed the end was near. Eva Braun asked to be addressed as Frau Hitler, and, according to Traudl, she said it with a calm that contrasted with the tension dominating every corridor. Shortly after, she invited Traudl to her room. There, to distract herself from her thoughts, she conversed with her and gave her a silver fox fur coat as a keepsake. In Traudl's eyes, that gesture was confirmation of a final farewell. During lunch, Hitler appeared restrained, almost mechanical, while the table maintained the routine of previous days. Afterward, he withdrew with Eva. It was then that Otto Günsche informed the secretaries that the Führer wished to say goodbye. According to Traudl, the image was unforgettable. Hitler appeared hunched, pale and with a vacant gaze, shaking each person's hand as if he were no longer present. Eva, for her part, embraced Traudl with a tearful whisper. "Try to get out alive and carry my memory to Bavaria." She wore the black dress with roses that he preferred, her hair carefully styled, as if she wished to preserve until the end the appearance she had chosen for herself. Shortly after, the sound of a gunshot shook the walls. The Goebbels children playing on the stairs mistook it for an artillery strike. Helmut even shouted that it had been a direct hit, unaware of how accurate his words were. According to Traudl, that moment marked the point at which everything shattered. Upon returning, Günther carried the smell of gasoline ingrained in his uniform. In a subdued voice, he confirmed that he had carried out the final order. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun had been incinerated in the garden of the Chancellery. For Traudl, the comment sounded like the definitive closure of an obsession that had held them captive until then. The young secretary gathered her courage and entered the room where they had died. She saw Eva's small revolver on the table next to a gauze handkerchief, the casing of the poison capsule glinting on the floor, and the upholstery marked with bloodstains. The air was thick with an intense smell of bitter almonds. As she later recalled, in that moment she felt neither devotion nor sadness, but a mix of emptiness and anger toward the man who had left them trapped in a hopeless fate. The wait in the bunker dragged on aimlessly, interrupted only by the gunfire and explosions reverberating from the surface. According to Traudl, the atmosphere had become surreal, as if everyone were moving within a shadowy stage set. A nurse and a man in a white coat carried 2 heavy boxes out of the Goebbels room. For a moment she feared that the 6 children lay inside, though no one dared to ask. Shortly after, Krebs and Berghof shook hands with those present and left to take their own lives in another room. It was each person's turn to decide how to face the end. Traudl recalled the last time she passed by Hitler's door. His grey coat, the cap with the golden eagle, and suede gloves still hung there. The dog's leash swayed as a silent reminder of what had happened hours earlier. To Traudl's eyes, that image was more unsettling than any explosion, the void left by a power now extinguished. She chose not to take any memento and kept only cigarettes and a few personal photographs. The order to leave came at dusk. Otto Günther led the group through collapsed corridors and broken staircases until they reached the surface. According to Traudl, the moon illuminated Wilhelmplatz, now a field of ruins, where even a dead horse had been reduced to scraps by the hunger of those still resisting underground. They crossed the square in silence until descending into the metro tunnels. Amid wounded bodies, exhausted civilians, and soldiers seeking shelter, they advanced toward Friedrichstrasse. There, under sniper fire, they managed to pass, though many of those following behind were hit. The hours that followed were an endless wandering through basements and burning streets. The group took refuge in an old brewery, now a stronghold of resistance. Monke was drafting a final report while Rattenhuber, wounded in the leg, delirious with fever, kept his pistol by his side. According to Traudl, the scene conveyed the mix of discipline and defeat that dominated the survivors. When it became clear that the Russians were surrounding the building, Monke urged the women to try to escape. "You can still make it to Dönitz," he told them. Traudl hesitated, but ultimately joined the others. They left behind helmets and weapons, crossed the courtyard where soldiers were piling their rifles, and passed through the ranks of the Red Army, which offered cigarettes and liquor to the prisoners. To Traudl's eyes, it was then, feeling invisible among the victors, that she could finally weep. Beyond the ruins of Berlin, Traudl Junge's aimless exodus. After leaving the ruins of Berlin, Traudl Junge's life entered uncertain terrain, dominated by flight and rootlessness. As she recalled, the days following the collapse were marked by the sensation of wandering aimlessly among thousands of refugees, all driven by the same instinct to escape the Red Army. During those days of transit, her former bunker companions disappeared one by one. Constanze Manziali, Hitler's dietitian, was led by Soviet soldiers into an underground tunnel and was never seen again. To Traudl, that scene encapsulated the fragility of them all. A single moment was enough for fate to be sealed without a trace. During her march, she came to share the road with a former concentration camp prisoner. He still wore the striped uniform, yet an odd silence prevailed between them. Junge admitted she didn't dare ask him about what he had endured, perhaps because she feared the answers. Later, she would acknowledge that her ignorance had also been a choice. It was easier to accept the propaganda that reduced those places to mere labor camps than to confront the reality of annihilation. The days of marching were filled with contrasts. The blooming meadows and trees in full spring seemed incompatible with the devastation of charred villages, starving animals, and entire families without shelter. In that setting, she met Katja, the wife of an SS officer, with whom she tried to cross the border into the British zone. They failed, and Traudl ended up back in Berlin under a false identity. She called herself Gerda Alt. For a time, she took refuge in her new friend's home, finding solace in small, everyday gestures that restored a sense of normalcy. Washing her hair, making coffee, or sleeping in a real bed. That fragile balance came to an end in June of 1945, when two supposed journalists with Russian accents knocked on her door. According to her, she immediately understood she was going to be arrested. Thus began a journey through makeshift prisons in the capital, from overcrowded cells to unsanitary basements. She was interrogated several times about the final days in the bunker, and during those sessions, she heard the stories of Soviet soldiers who had lost entire families under the German invasion. It was there, as she would later acknowledge, that she began to glimpse that the atrocities committed in Russia had been the prelude to the vengeance now descending upon Germany. Amid this landscape, Arkady appeared, an Armenian interpreter in the service of the Soviet army. With unexpectedly courteous manners, he transferred her to temporary lodging, secured papers for her, and eventually a position at the Charité hospital. According to Traudl, it was the first time someone in that newly occupied Germany extended a hand without demanding anything in return. Even so, the precariousness was evident. Her salary barely covered basic food, and the memories of the bunker weighed heavier than any material need. Meanwhile, in letters sent to her mother in Bavaria, she tried to paint a lighter, almost domestic life, as if to shield her from the truth. "The important thing is that I'm still alive," she wrote in one of them. But beneath that mask of normalcy, an inner struggle with her past persisted. The fascination she had felt for Hitler as a paternal figure contrasted with the certainty of having been a close witness to his criminal machinery. After months of hardship in Berlin, Traudl Junge began working at the Charité. As she wrote in her letters, that job was more of a truce than a true life plan. She worked while awaiting the chance to return to Bavaria. Obtaining an official permit in April of 1946 finally opened that possibility. With the help of an acquaintance, Erika, she embarked on a new attempt to escape. The first try failed, intercepted by a Soviet guard who, fortunately, only sent them back to the eastern zone. The second time, thanks to a farmer who hid them in his tractor, they managed to cross the border and reach the British zone. In her memoirs, she vividly recalled the morning she first heard the song of a nightingale. That sound symbolized for her the crossing into freedom. The journey south was fraught with uncertainties, but they reached Munich, and from there, Traudl arrived in Breitbrunn on Easter Sunday. The reunion with her mother and sister was marked by relief, but also by silences. No one in the family asked too much about her past in Berlin. They themselves had suffered losses and seemed to want to protect her. Traudl, however, needed to share what she had experienced and found in her mother, a listener free of reproach. That initial calm did not last long. An indiscretion by an old friend led the authorities to learn of her role in the bunker. A few days later, a policeman arrested her and she was transferred to prison. She remained there for several weeks under American custody. An officer of Jewish origin interrogated her, asking her to write an account of the final days with Hitler. Traudl wrote only a few pages, fearful of exposing herself too much. Even so, the testimony sparked great interest, though she rejected any offers for publication. As she later confessed, she feared her escape from the Soviet zone would be discovered. Released after a brief period, she returned to Breitbrunn under a form of local arrest. In the following years, she tried to rebuild her life in Munich. She shared a room with her sister Inge, who had begun a career in cabaret. Traudl found work in offices, publishing houses and small companies, accepting any job that allowed her to survive. She often mentioned the contrast between the rigidity of the past and the intellectual openness of the present. She discovered banned authors, foreign music, and a cultural scene in full bloom. Friendships also proved crucial in her adaptation. The Raff couple, despite their past marked by Nazi persecution, welcomed her without reservation. Through the writer Karl Ude, she connected with a liberal and democratic circle that influenced her thinking. He knew who she had been but avoided reproaches, preferring to look forward. That environment allowed her to experience for the first time what she described as a conscious life, marked by reflection and a search for meaning after years of obedience and silence. In 1947, the formal proof of her exoneration came during the Denazification process. Classified as a youthful follower, she was deemed free of major responsibilities. For her, it was an administrative formality, though, in retrospect, that system functioned more as a pact of collective forgetting than a true reckoning with the past. In those years, most of German society, like her, seemed determined to rebuild rather than remember. The 1950s brought a climate of recovery to Germany. The so-called economic miracle began to transform the country, fostering a sense that society could once again matter on the international stage. For Traudl Junge, those years unfolded between professional opportunities and personal dilemmas. Her sister Inge emigrated to Australia in 1951, and shortly afterward, her mother also travelled there for an extended period. Traudl stayed in Munich, where she was relocated to a modest public housing apartment in Musach, which she described as inhospitable but preferable to displaced persons' shelters. In her professional life, she found a space of stability in the press. Thanks to a contact, she joined the editorial staff of the magazine Quick, then prestigious for its critical reporting and its focus on recent history. Although her colleagues were aware of her past in the Reich Chancellery, they never directly questioned her about it. It was in that environment, as she would later acknowledge, that she discovered with shock the true magnitude of the regime's crimes. Learning that Karl Brandt, a doctor she had considered cultured and refined, had been executed for experiments on prisoners confronted her with a reality she had preferred to ignore. For 3 years, she worked alongside the editor-in-chief until a personal and professional relationship with a collaborator from the science section led her to leave the magazine. That bond, which lasted over a decade, provided her with travel, independence, and a new direction in life. However, her letters and diaries from that period reveal the tension between the affection she still received from her former fiancé, Heinz Bald, now settled in the United States, and her relationship with a married man in Germany. She herself admitted to feeling trapped between the need for emotional security and the fear of repeating past mistakes. Amid this emotional instability, she achieved some professional recognition. She wrote articles, participated in research, and in 1959 published a book about domestic animals, a subject that sparked an enthusiasm she had not felt before. That editorial venture, though modest in sales, allowed her to experience for the first time the satisfaction of working on something that truly ignited her interest. By the end of the decade, new approaches regarding her past began to emerge. Historians and journalists sought her testimony, and in 1954, she even collaborated in Vienna as an assistant director on the film The Last Act, inspired by Hitler's final days. She accepted cautiously, fearing that Soviet authorities might recall her escape from Berlin. With the payment from that job, she moved to an apartment in Schwabing, a neighborhood with a cultural atmosphere more aligned with her interests. In her private life, some old friendships reappeared, such as the photographer Erica Stone, who had emigrated to New York. Their reunion occurred without reproaches, though it was clear that the shadow of Hitler had irrevocably marked Traudl's life. She herself admitted that, despite her efforts to integrate into post-war normality, her time alongside the dictator shaped any perception of herself. Years later, she would acknowledge that her greatest mistake was not ignorance, but a lack of will to look beyond what was in front of her. According to her, she preferred not to know, and that evasion weighed as heavily as any direct complicity. By sharing her testimony, she sought to warn about the dangers of moral indifference and unreflective obedience. Finally, Traudl Junge died in Munich on the 10th of February 2002, a victim of cancer, at the age of 81.